In the midst of a lively metropolis, a formidable CEO is racing against the clock to secure a lucrative multi-million-dollar contract. In his rush, his costly suit sustains a tear, and he becomes deeply anxious about the potential damage to his impeccable image in front of a demanding client. He hurries into a dilapidated tailor shop, seeking a swift repair. Upon entering, he is instantly captivated by the skilled craftsmanship and unwavering determination of the single mother and her young son who operate the shop. To show his gratitude for the complimentary mending, he makes a significant choice, one that will assist not only individuals but also address the burdens they carry. The city was stifling under the pressure of its own hustle and bustle. Towering skyscrapers loomed over crowded streets, their reflective surfaces capturing the harsh morning sunlight, transforming entire blocks into a dazzling maze of glass and steel. Below, the roads resembled a battleground, with cars inching forward in agonizing bursts, horns blaring in frustration, and delivery trucks clogging narrow intersections. Pedestrians navigated in frantic waves, pushing past one another while balancing coffee cups, briefcases, and a relentless race against time. Inside a sleek black sedan, David Miller sat rigidly, his jaw clenched and fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against the leather armrest. The air conditioning hummed softly, providing a stark contrast to the chaos outside, yet it did little to alleviate the heat rising within him. His gaze darted to the dashboard clock. 30 minutes was all he had left before the meeting commenced, a meeting that could solidify his position at the pinnacle of success or plunge him into obscurity. He exhaled through his nose, a controlled but tense release. The deal had been in the works for several months, with the client being a perfectionist, a woman renowned for her ruthless efficiency and unwavering standards. A single misstep, a hint of carelessness, weakness, or poor preparation could cost him everything. His phone buzzed on the center console. He barely glanced at the name before swiping it open. The message was brief, almost taunting. Jason Harris, see you there? Miller, hope you don't get stuck in traffic. It would be a shame to miss out. A slow burn ignited in David's chest. Of course, he was en route. Jason Harris was like a vulture, always circling and waiting for the slightest misstep to swoop in and seize what wasn't his. He was relentless, cutthroat, and unfortunately, exceptionally skilled at what he did. If Jason arrived at the meeting first, it wouldn't merely be a disadvantage. It would be a death sentence for David's chances. He straightened in his seat, scanning the road ahead. Nothing was moving, not an inch. The lanes were completely gridlocked, a sea of honking cars stretching endlessly into the distance. Gritting his teeth, he realized this was untenable. With a swift motion, David yanked open the car door. Sir, his driver barely had time to react before David was stepping out, his polished dress shoes striking the hot pavement. Take the car back, he instructed, barely turning his head. I'll get there faster on foot. And off he went. As he turned into the alley, the city's noise lessened slightly, though the air remained thick with heat and the scent of asphalt. His footsteps echoed against the brick walls as he moved swiftly but deliberately. Years of maneuvering through the corporate world had taught him the importance of efficiency. No time wasted, no effort squandered. He wove through the narrow passage, dodging discarded crates and stepping over puddles of stagnant rainwater. The aroma of fresh bread wafted from a bakery's back door, mingling with the acrid stench of overflowing dumpsters baking in the sun. Then it happened. A sharp tug against his side, sudden and jolting, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing. He halted abruptly, his heartbeat already elevated from running, now pounding against his ribs for an entirely different reason. Slowly, he looked down. The tear was substantial, stretching from his chest down toward his ribs, a jagged wound in expensive fabric. David's stomach twisted. He could already hear the client's voice in his mind dissecting the implications. Sloppy, careless, unprepared. He understood how these situations operated. Optics mattered. He couldn't enter that meeting looking like this. It didn't matter if his proposal was flawless or if his figure surpassed Jason's. First impressions were everything. His mind raced. There had to be something, somewhere. Then he spotted it, nestled between two aged brick buildings. A small tailor shop, nearly hidden, its faded sign barely legible. The display window was cluttered with worn fabric and half-finished garments, draped over mannequins that had seen better days. A single ceiling fan whirred lazily inside, circulating the warm morning air. It wasn't ideal, but it was his only option. David pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed overhead to announce his arrival. The air inside was different, warmer, carrying the scent of fabric and something faintly metallic, like the lingering traces of an old sewing machine. It was quieter, too, the chaos of the city muffled by the thick walls. For a moment he hesitated. The place felt old, well-worn, lived in. Then he saw her. Behind the counter, bent over a sewing machine, was a woman named Mary Johnson. Her hands moved with practiced ease, guiding fabric through a machine with an efficiency that could only be honed through years of experience. There was no hesitation in her movements, no wasted effort. She was quick, precise, and professional in a manner that had nothing to do with wealth or status, but stemmed from pure, unshakable skill. Across the room, a young boy sat at a small wooden table, hunched over an old, tattered notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration as he scribbled with a pencil that had been reduced to little more than a stub. Beside him lay a textbook, its spine cracked and pages yellowed from extensive use. The scene was simple, even unremarkable, yet something about it. The contrast between the boy's determination and the woman's quiet, relentless work made David pause. He didn't have time to linger on it. "Please, I need this fixed," he said, his voice clipped and controlled. Mary looked up, seemingly unperturbed, nor did she rush to respond. Instead, she assessed him, her gaze moving from his face to his torn jacket, calculating. Without a word, she rose from her stool, wiped her hands on her apron, and took the garment from him. She didn't ask questions or comment on his urgency. She simply began to work. Her fingers moved quickly, yet not carelessly. She reached into a small wooden box on the counter, retrieving a delicately embroidered flower, something she had stitched in advance. With deft hands, she placed it over the tear and began securing it, her needle moving with a speed born not of panic, but of years of practice. David could do nothing but watch the rhythmic pull of the thread, the way her hands operated with muscle memory. No hesitation, no second-guessing. The soft scratch of the pencil against paper continued as the boy remained engrossed in his work. For the first time that morning, David felt a sense of calm. 7 minutes later, Mary tied the last knot, snipped the excess thread, and handed him the jacket. David took it, running his fingers over the flower that now covered the tear, seamless and clean, as if it had always been there. He exhaled, pulled out his wallet, and froze. Only credit cards, no cash. His gaze flicked to Mary and then back to the tiny shop, the aging walls, the worn floorboards, and the frayed edges of the boy's notebook. This was a place barely scraping by. He knew it, and she knew it. Without a word, he twisted his gold ring from his finger and placed it on the counter. Mary didn't even blink. She pushed the ring back toward him. "You don't need to do that," she said simply. Then, reaching behind the counter, she pulled out a cool, damp cloth and handed it to him. "Here," she added, to help with the heat. David hesitated, his fingers brushing against the fabric. For the first time in a long while, he felt caught off guard, but he accepted it. As he walked out the door, pulling the now-perfect jacket back over his shoulders, something within him shifted. Something he couldn't quite identify. The moment David stepped out of Tailor's shop, the heat of the morning hit him again, pressing against his skin, heavy and unrelenting. The world outside had moved on, indifferent to the seconds he had lost, the minutes slipping through his fingers. His pulse was still elevated, his body wired from sprint through the alley, the unexpected detour, the precious time he lacked. He pressed the damp cloth to his face, inhaling the faint scent of detergent and clean linen, wiping away the sweat that clung to his brow. 20 minutes left. That was all he had. He moved quickly, his shoes striking the pavement with sharp, deliberate steps, the tailored fabric of his suit settling back into place as if nothing had ever been amiss. Except something had changed. The sensation of the embroidered flower against his chest was impossible to ignore. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, the stitching was flawless. Yet it served as a reminder, a quiet contradiction stitched into the very fabric of who he was. He pushed the thought aside, It didn't matter, not now. The corporate tower loomed ahead, all glass and steel, sterile in its perfection. The moment he stepped inside, the noise of the city dulled, replaced by the quiet hum of wealth, the kind of silence only money could buy. His own reflection stared back at him from the polished elevator doors as they slid open, his face unreadable and composed. Inside, he adjusted his cuffs and collar, a final check to ensure he appeared sharp, professional, and uncompromised. Yet, his fingers hesitated over the embroidered flower before he dropped his hand, suppressing any thoughts about it. The conference room was bathed in natural light, with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline, a breathtaking display of power and success. At the far end of the table sat Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who held the fate of the contract in her hands. Everything about her was curated. The precision of her movements, the sharpness in her eyes, the way she didn't waste time on anything unnecessary. Across from her sat Jason Harris, already seated and smiling that knowing, practiced smile. David didn't hesitate. He owned the room the moment he walked in. "Eleanor," he greeted, his voice steady, her gaze assessing. "You're cutting it close." Jason leaned back in his chair slightly, enough to imply comfort. "I was just telling Eleanor how much I admire punctuality. It demonstrates discipline." David smiled, not forced or rushed, just enough. "Good thing I'm on time, then." He took his seat, feeling Jason's eyes flicker down briefly, assessing him, searching. But Eleanor wasn't looking at him. She was focused on his jacket, on the flower. It was subtle. The way her head tilted slightly, the way her fingers tapped once against the table, as if making a mental note of a detail noticed but not questioned. Jason noticed too, and he didn't understand. That was the difference between them. The meeting commenced, numbers, projections, logistics. David navigated it all with practiced ease. He was prepared, as he always was. However, something about today felt different. Not because of what he was saying, but because of how he felt while saying it. Confident, composed, steady. Jason recognized it too. He saw in the way his competitor's smile tightened, in the way his rebuttal came just a moment too late, in the way Eleanor's attention never once strayed from David. When the meeting concluded, it was done. The deal was sealed, the contract was his. Jason realized it too. David saw in the way he adjusted his tie, his expression smooth but his eyes sharp with restrained irritation. "Well played, Miller," he said, his voice easy but hollow. "I guess we'll see how it works out for you." David merely smiled, shaking Eleanor's hand firmly. "I think we both know how it's going to turn out." As he turned to leave, Eleanor spoke once more. "That embroidery on your jacket." He paused, Jason turning almost too quickly. Eleanor studied the stitching with interest, her sharp gaze flicking up to meet his. "Interesting detail. I like it." David held her gaze for just a moment longer before nodding. "So do I?" For the first time in a long while, he realized he meant it. The morning felt different. The same sun climbed over the city skyline, spilling gold over the streets, but the rush felt distant now, as if the world had taken a step back. The traffic still moved. The noise still swirled through the air, yet none of it reached David in the same way. He walked not with urgency, but with purpose, his footsteps echoing against the pavement, a stark contrast to the hurried, chaotic rhythm of the morning before. This wasn't a race against time. This wasn't a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. This was a choice. The Tailor shop looked just as worn as before, nestled between taller, stronger buildings, almost as if it had been left behind by time itself. The wooden sign above still swayed, the paint peeling at the edges, its once bold letters now faded by years of sun and rain. The display window was cluttered with bolts of fabric stacked haphazardly, an old sewing machine standing proudly like an artifact from another era. The door, weathered yet sturdy, stood slightly ajar, allowing the faintest hum of life inside to escape. David stepped through, and the bell above the door chimed softly, a whisper compared to mechanical precision of corporate boardrooms and high-rise offices. Inside, nothing had changed, yet somehow everything felt different. Mary was at her usual spot, hunched over her sewing machine, the needle moving with sharp, practiced precision. There was no hesitation in her hands, no wasted effort. Every stitch, every adjustment emanated from a place of deeply ingrained skill. This was not merely work. It was survival. In the corner, Jimmy was at the same small wooden table, engrossed in his notebook. His lips moved slightly as he worked through an equation, his tiny fingers gripping a pencil that had been sharpened down to the last possible inch, a pencil that should have been replaced long ago. David exhaled. Yesterday he had entered as a man on a mission to get in, fix the problem, and get out. He had looked but hadn't seen. But now, standing there, watching them, the weight of their world pressing in from every corner of the small shop, he truly saw. Mary glanced up, startled by his presence. "You again," she said, though there was no accusation in her voice, just mild surprise. David nodded slightly, stepping further inside. This time, he didn't have to explain why he was there. He didn't rush. "I came to thank you," he finally said. Mary paused, a needle between her fingers, giving him a skeptical look. "For what?" "For yesterday the stitching in the cloth." He hesitated, his eyes scanning the room once more, taking in everything he had previously ignored. "For more than that." She studied him for a moment before shrugging lightly and returning to her work. "It was nothing." It wasn't nothing. His gaze lingered on her hands, noticing the way her knuckles tightened slightly when she spoke, the way her shoulders bore an invisible weight. She was weary, not just physically, but in a manner that years of struggle etched into a person. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "How long have you had this place?" Mary didn't look up, still threading the needle with precise fingers. "It was my mother's. She ran it for as long as I can remember. I took over after she passed." His eyes flicked to the shelves, neatly stacked with fabric that had seen better days, bolts of material carefully folded despite their frayed edges. With a quiet laugh, humorless, she added, "You tell me." He didn't need her to explain. He already understood. The tailor shop wasn't failing because of her. It was failing because the world had ceased to look. People like him, corporate men, men in suits, men who moved through life calculating every gain and loss, walked past places like this without a second thought. His gaze drifted to Jimmy, still scribbling furiously in his notebook. The boy didn't glance up, didn't acknowledge the conversation unfolding in the room. He was too focused. "Your son?" David asked, his voice softer now. Mary's expression shifted slightly. "He's smart. Works hard. I try to save what I can for school, but," she sighed, rubbing a tired hand over her forehead, "there's never enough." David didn't respond immediately. He let her words settle, allowing their truth to take shape in his mind. She had given him everything yesterday without expecting anything in return. Not just a quick stitch, not just a piece of fabric, but dignity. Now, sitting there, he realized how little she had, and yet how much she still refused to take. Then she said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it made his stomach churn. "We're 3 months behind on rent." David inhaled sharply but kept his reaction from showing on his face. Instead, he glanced around once more, truly seeing it this time. The flickering light bulb, the sewing machine, its edges worn from years of constant use, the cracked leather chair tucked into the corner. The weight of it settled over him like a slow-moving storm. She wasn't just fighting to keep a business afloat. She was fighting to maintain a home. Just like that, the decision formed in his mind. David leaned back, exhaling slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of his cuff, feeling the delicate embroidery, a reminder where he had been and what had changed. "I have a space," he finally said. Mary finally looked at him, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "A space?" "A storefront," he clarified, watching her carefully. "On Main Street." Her expression hardened, as if bracing for the inevitable catch. "I can't afford a place like that." David shook his head. "It's not for rent." A beat passed. "It's yours." Silence enveloped the room. Mary stared, and Jimmy's pencil stopped scratching against the paper. For the first time, she looked truly unsettled. David didn't waver. "You move in, no rent, no conditions. I'll help you set up, get the right customers in, and Jimmy," his gaze flicked to the boy, "he'll have what he needs for school." Mary's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged, as this wasn't supposed to happen. People like him, corporate men, men in suits who moved through life calculating every gain and loss, didn't do this. They didn't see people like her, but he had. For the first time, he was doing something without a profit in mind. Mary's fingers tightened around the fabric in front of her, gripping it as if anchoring herself to reality. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't even know me." David exhaled, his lips curving into faintest, tired smile. "I didn't yesterday, and that was enough." A week later, the old shop was gone. The peeling sign, the cracked floorboards, the dim light struggling to remain illuminated, all left behind. In its place, on a bustling street where people noticed and came to spend, a new storefront emerged. Mary's tailor shop, fine stitchwork, custom designs. The windows gleamed, and the space inside was open and inviting. It wasn't just a shop, it was a new beginning. Outside, standing in front of it, was Jimmy, his backpack new, his uniform crisp, and his eyes bright with something David hadn't seen before, hope. David stood beside him, watching as Mary unlocked the door for the first time. She turned to him, her eyes unreadable, a million words left unsaid. He simply nodded. "You helped me first," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. As they stepped inside, the bell chimed softly, a welcoming sound that filled the air with promise. Mary moved with renewed energy, her hands deftly arranging the fabric and tools she had once thought lost. Jimmy settled at his small table, pulling out his notebook, ready to work on his studies in a space that felt like home. David lingered for a moment, taking in the warmth of the shop, the laughter of the mother and son, and the vibrant atmosphere that now surrounded them. He realized that this wasn't just about a contract or a business deal. It was about people, connections, and the profound impact of kindness and community. In the days that followed, Mary's shop flourished. Word spread quickly about the skilled tailor and her unique designs. Customers began to flock to her store, drawn not only by the quality of her work, but also by the warmth and authenticity that filled the space. With David's help, they hosted events, showcasing her creations and bringing the neighborhood together. David found himself visiting often, not just as a benefactor, but as a friend. He watched as Mary and Jimmy thrived, their lives transforming in ways they had never imagined. The burdens they had carried began to lift, replaced by hope and possibility. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the bustling street, David stood outside the shop, watching the world go by. He felt a sense of fulfillment that transcended business success. He had made a choice that changed lives, and in doing so, he had discovered a part of himself he had long forgotten. Mary stepped outside, a smile lighting up her face as she joined him. "Thank you," she said softly, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "For everything." David nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. "No, thank you. You've shown me what truly matters." As they stood together, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, a reminder that in the heart of a bustling city, amidst the chaos and competition, there was still room for compassion, community, and the transformative power of human connection. And in that moment, David knew he had not only secured a contract, but had also forged a bond that would last far beyond the walls of any boardroom.